Okay, we're in Parshas Vigash. Perek Mem Zayin. Pasuk Dalid. Vayomru el Paroi Nogur ba'oretz banu. Okay, so they told him Nogur ba'oretz banu. And we started discussing this in the previous year, that the notion of Megurim appears much in the following psukim, because when Yaakov answers Paro's question, Kami Yemei Shnei Chayecha, he says Yemei Shnei Megurai are such and such, and the Lohisigres Yemei Shnei Chaye Avosai Bimei Megurehem. And we said also we have to look at this and compare it with the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, where it says Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz Megure Aviv. So the Aretz there, the Eretz Canaan, is described as the Eretz Megure Aviv, and here they're coming Logur Baretz. Okay, so now, what does it mean Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz Megure Aviv? We discussed there and last week that Yaakov is trying to do a yeshiva in the land which his father treated as a land of Megurim, as he calls it here, in his words to Paro, Eretz Megurehem. And Hashem said to Avram, B'nasati l'chol zaruchas Eretz Megurecha. He's called Eretz Canaan. Vayeshev Yaakov Eretz Megure Aviv means in the land which for his father was land of Megurim, which is temporary. He sought to establish a more permanent kind of dwelling, a yeshiva. Thus Chazal say, Bikesh Yaakov le'yeshiv b'shalva. And they say furthermore, Im Lavan Garti, he did his Megurim and now he's ready to do Vayeshev. His father did Megurim and now he's ready to do Vayeshev. He wanted to arrive at the permanence that was promised, let's say to Avram. So a land of Megurim, which is a temporary dwelling, will eventually turn into an achuzas olam. And Yaakov, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz Megurim, he's trying to surpass his father, who did Megurim, and turn it into yeshiva, which probably has something to do with his calling upon the Yemei Megurehem of his fathers, and now his fathers ended up being happier and longer lived than he, and they were dwelling temporarily, and he sought to do more than that. So it might have something to do with that. The other thing we pointed out was that at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, we have Yosef and Sheva Esrei Shana. So it's as if Yaakov had 17 good years before the tragedy of Yosef. And then he had another 17 good years when he reunited with Yosef, which is the beginning of the next parasha, Vayichi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim Sheva Esrei Shana. The Gematria Vayichi is 34, so he had 17 plus 17 years of Chayim. Pari asks him, Kami Yemei Shnei Chayecha, and he talks about how Ma'at V'roim, but Vayichi, he had 34 years that were truly worthy of the name Chayim. Shnois Chayim, years of being alive, like Vatachi Ruach Yaakov, Vayichi Yaakov. So that also brings us back to Vayeshev, that there's a new period that's beginning now, which parallels the period in the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, which takes us to 17 years till tragedy strikes. And similarly, there's 17 years here, where after the tragedy was resolved. To be clear, it's not that he lived in Eretz Canaan for 17 years, but there was a 17-year period of good life, and we have this expression of living be'eretz Megure, and here they have Logur ba'aretz banu. So it seems to be a parallel. Okay. And the parsha ends, Parshas Vayigash ends, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Kodesh v'yachazui bo v'yifru v'yibur ma'od, which read in conjunction with Logur, or in contrast with Logur, suggests the following. They originally said they're here Logur, which suggests a temporary dwelling, But even after the hunger passed, they ended up staying in Mitzrayim. Therefore, it says Vayeshev Yisrael Be'etz Mitzrayim. So Lagur Ba'aretz Banu, we only came Lagur, but they ended up doing yeshiva. And that leads us to a question. Famously, as we say in the Haggadah, Vayogor Shom B'Mesei Ma'ot, Melamed Shalo Yard Yaakov Avinu L'Shtakeh B'Mitzrayim, Elo Lagur Shom Shenemar Lagur Ba'aretz Banu. Okay, so their intention was not to stay. What was their intention? To be there temporarily. Why temporarily? Oh, because there's a hunger. So why didn't they leave after the hunger? And the question is like this. The hunger had another 5 years to run, so leave 5 years later. And if Yaakov brought an end to the hunger, 3 psukim from now, Vayevarech Yaakov es parei, pasuk yud. And that's what Chazal say, that brought an end to the hunger, because now the Nile overflowed its banks. So the hunger was actually over shortly after this statement where they said, we're here only to live temporarily. So why don't they just turn on their heels and go home? So once there's mirror, either 5 years later or perhaps very shortly afterwards, they should be going back. Now, some people say, but this is insufficient. Some people say, well, Hashem told, it's a partial answer, as we shall see. Hashem told Yaakov, "V'anochi al chagam oloi." I will take you out of Mitzrayim. So because Hashem told Yaakov, I will take you out of Mitzrayim, therefore Yaakov couldn't leave Mitzrayim on a human initiative. You have to wait for Hashem to take him out. Now this is incomplete, very incomplete, because V'anochi al chagam oloi is referring to Yaakov himself. It's referring to the fact that Yaakov was taken out of Mitzrayim for burial. Now, how was Yaakov taken out of Mitzrayim for burial? Not through any divine intervention, but rather through Yaakov placing an oath. First on Yosef, and then on the brothers as well. In the end of Perek Mem Tes, he said, commanded them to take him back to Eretz Yisrael. And that is the fulfillment of Anochi al Chagam Oloi. Because that's how Hashem does things, through all sorts of means, including human initiative. So, to say that, you know why they had to be Mitzrayim, is because Hashem had to take them out, is meaningless, because if they would leave Mitzrayim, of course, that would be Hashem taking them out. Okay. Now, some say, well, Yaakov couldn't leave. So Yaakov said, I want to see Yosef. So could he turn around and leave? No, because since Hashem appeared to him on his way out and told him, Yosef Yoshes Yodei Aleinecha, I think the Archaim says this. So therefore, he was told that he has to stay in time till he dies. And that's acceptable regarding Yaakov, but not regarding the rest. In other words, after Yaakov died, then they could leave. Well, you could say, Hashem told Yaakov, Al tir mitzrayim ki legodol hasimcha sham. So they had a nevuah that they have to be Mitzrayim until they become a goy gadol. But that only takes us to the end of the parsha, where it says, Vayifru vayirbu ma'id. But once they became a goy gadol, then why don't they leave? Already in the end of Vayechi, we have this implication that they're waiting for Hashem to take them out. Because Yosef, when he dies, he told his brothers, Anochi meis, ve'elokim pakod yifkid eschem v'helo eschem in artz hazois, take me with you. Hashem is going to remember you, and bring you up from this land to the land that he swore to Abraham and Yaakov. So that tells us that something has to happen until they could leave, as if they're stuck there, and that needs to be explained. How are they stuck there? Okay, we'll get back to this. There's something going on over here. It's a very important question, of course. And remarkably, from what I looked around, I didn't see anyone do. I mean, I saw a few people touch on it briefly. It's a very fundamental question. Of course, it relates to the whole question of remaining in Golos and all that. Shavuos v'chulu. Okay, let's focus on a different aspect over here, which will, I think, will help shed light on the other thing also as well. So what they say, Pasuk Daled, Lagur ba'aretz banu, why? Ki ein mira latzona shel avodecha, ki chavid hara be'eretz Canaan. The reason why we're here to live is because there's no pasture for your servant's sheep, because the hunger in Canaan is very heavy. It's heavy. Okay. This is remarkable, because what they're saying is that they have no problem with the hunger. It's their sheep that they're worried about. It's the sheep that's a problem. That's not what Yosef said. Yosef said, you have to come down to Mitzrayim because it's 5 years left of the hunger. And they're only worried about the sheep. What's going on over here? Another problem is, the Ramban asked this question. They say, okay, there's no pasture for the sheep because Chavid hara be'eretz Canaan. In Mitzrayim, there is pasture for the sheep. Why? In Mitzrayim, they stockpiled grain for the people. But where's the mirror? Mirror means there's grazing. But Mitzrayim also underwent the hunger. Pella. Where are they supposed to graze in Mitzrayim? So the Ramban says, Mitzrayim, there are rivers and tributaries, and swamps. So even if there was a hunger because the Nile didn't overflow, so it didn't irrigate the rest of Mitzrayim, but around the river there's going to be patches of greenery, of vegetation. So there's going to be places for the sheep to graze. Mashiach Eretz Canaan, it's completely dry, and even the sheep can't graze. There's nothing growing. Okay. So I want you to think about this. Keep that in mind. That they're saying is that we're happy as long as our sheep have where to graze. And in Mitzrayim, despite the hunger, there were still places for the sheep to graze. This reminds me of Yeshaya Perek Lamed, which we spoke about a lot. Yeshaya Perek Lamed and its correspondence to, or even you could say with our parsha. It's like talking to each other. Yeshaya Perek Lamed, which begins with decrying those who go down to Mitzrayim without asking Hashem, and they take strength in Parai and refuge in the shade of Mitzrayim. Ufi lo sha'alu. It's going to end up being an embarrassment for you, the strength you tried to get from Parai, etc., etc. Okay. And we keep on going back to this Perek, and specifically these psukim, Pasuk Yutes, which talks about the possibility for a nation to dwell in Zion and in Yerushalayim. Pasuk Chav, Hashem is going to give you lechem tsar, mayim lachatz. So you're not going to be rich, but Hashem will give you the bare minimum and you'll survive. And then it talks about Hashem is going to make it rain, and the land is going to be fertile, and your cattle will be roya. Kar nirchav. And as we discussed, and then the next parak talks about that we are like Hashem's sheep. And as we discussed, that there's a message over here, which we see in Yeshaya Perek Lamed and Tehillim Kuf Mem Zayin, that animals are fed by Hashem. And humans who will make themselves sheep-like can also be dependent on Hashem in the same way animals are. They don't have to seek the might. They don't have to seek power and human might. They can accept their position of dependence, like animals accept their position of dependence on Hashem, and Hashem delivers to them. They might not be so wealthy, as says Yeshaya, but lechem tzar mayim lachatz. That's okay. And there, that's associated with Tzion and Yerushalayim. So too, when there's a hunger, you could stay in Tzion, stay in Yerushalayim. You're not going to have too much bread. You might have to go to Mitzrayim every couple of months or whatever. But that's okay. You don't have to worry so much about the hunger. Yosef is very worried about the hunger. Yosef is the one who says, no, we need power. We need the Mitzri kind of order the mitzvah kind of interests are correct, the gvuras hasus, like it says in Yeshai, I'm telling you, bahashkit bavitcha, tia gvuras, and you say, no, I want to run on the horse. That corresponds to the gvuras hasus, yeah, but as we discussed. So Yosef says, wait a second, there's a hunger. I don't want you to become poor, penti varesh. Yeshai says, penti varesh, big deal. Lechem tzar mayim lachatz. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? Animals are poor. Animals are not rich. Yesh b'zeh mashu, argument. But Yosef insists they have to move. You have to come to Mitzrayim. I don't want you to become poor. So let's think about this. It's important to understand. Yosef's insistence that they have to move should not be taken for granted. That's Yosef's position. There's another position that says we can live in Eretz Yisrael. And then there's Yaakov's position that says, well, I have to go see him. Okay? I remember we said, what did Yaakov want? Yaakov says, I'm going to see him, and then I'm going to die. Remember, Yaakov is ready to die. He's over. He's done. Then he has a renaissance. And he lives another 17 years, as we discussed. He has another 17 good years. In his conversation with Parah, he's sort of still talking about his life being over. My life didn't reach my father's life. But parenthetically, we'll get to this soon. Bad asks, what do you mean my life didn't reach my father's life? Maybe it still will. The answer is, I think, yeah, Yosef, at that point, Yaakov is talking from the perspective of someone who's still going to die. But as we've discussed, when Yosef brings him into Parah and it ends with a blessing to Parah, something shifts and Yaakov comes back into his own. Okay, we shall see about that. This is something that's troubling me about where that shifts. The two studim over here. But Yaakov says like this, I'm ready to die. I have to see Yosef. If Yaakov is ready to die, and he's going to transfer over the determination of how we're going to run his family to Yosef, then Yosef's insistence that you can't be poor is going to be accepted, and then we're going to move to Mitzrayim and be rich. But ultimately, that's not what's going to happen. Yaakov is going to have a role in controlling Bnei Yisrael, as we discussed at length, and we'll discuss it again. That Yaakov is going to bring back the derech, which is called Roitz Hashem Es Yireyav, or Ein Hashem Alireyav L'Chayosim B'Ra'av, and he's going to bring an end to the hunger. And according to that paradigm is that, listen, we rely on Hashem, and if there's a hunger, it's also not the end of the world. We can have lechem tzar mayim lachatz, as long as we're depending on Hashem like animals do, because really all we want to be is like animals. So I would suggest then that the mirror over here is teaching us that point, that, and this reminds you of what I discussed in the previous shurim about the whole focus on animals here, is that Bnei Yisrael are willing to be dependent on Hashem like animals are dependent on Hashem, and that's important, the fact that they're shepherds. They learn dependence on Hashem. And here they're saying, look, we have no problem with having a small amount of food. All we have to eat is as much as our sheep do. But if our sheep have no food, then it's a real problem. What does that mean that that's the real problem? It means basically what they're saying is our minimum, it's a way of pointing to the fact that our standard of living is the same as our animals. And as long as our animals are good, we're good. Don't worry much about us. We just need the same thing that the animals do. But if the animals don't even have, that's when they're really stuck. So that's why I think they're shifting. In Echanami, Yosef told them, you have to come live here because your whole family's going to become poor. They don't really care about that because they're already going back. Now they brought Yaakov back to life, as it were, because Yosef's insisting, my father's here. He's not going to die. He's going to have another 17 good years. Now that that's happening, they are now giving indications that they are following the path, the method that the Navi prescribes for the ambitzion and not the mitzvah path, which is to say lechem tzar mayim lachatz, and you can live like the animal does, depend on Hashem, and then P'tom Hashem is going to bring rain, and your animals are going to have a lot of grain, as it continues in Yishai. But the way it starts is saying the animal doesn't go crazy when there's a hunger. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to have a lot of money. I'm not going to be rich. I'm not going to be secure. So you could be the same way. So similarly, they're saying the same thing. That's what they're saying over here. All we care about is having the minimum that our animals required. And I think there's also another point over here that it turns out, as we mentioned, that although Mitzrayim was struck by hunger, there was still a place for the animals to pasture. which means that the only things that were safe from hunger, even when the hunger struck Mitzrayim, were the animals. Which basically then suggests that if you wanted to be safe from hunger, you have to be like an animal. That's the whole thing we're saying, that the real protection from hunger is to be dependent on Hashem. Right? Like sheep. And remember we said, the Gemara says refers to sheep, because in that mizmor, it's talking about how to survive a hunger. And the key to survive a hunger is to say, as long as my sheep are full, I'm fine, because I don't want to be any better than a sheep. That is the idea over here. Okay, it's amazing. Now I want to go back to, I feel like this ties in, I think it does, especially because I'm not so clear about how everything comes together here. Meaning I'm not so clear, there's different movements going on, right? There's Yosef's Mahalach, there's Yaakov's Mahalach, there's Yosef bringing back Yaakov, putting him into the picture, and that changes everything. And there's a question of where that changes. Where does Yaakov himself change, and where does that carry over to how the brothers talk? So this is what I'm not so clear about. But I think it all ties into the question I want to go back to now, which is that they couldn't leave Mitzrayim. Once they came, they couldn't leave. Even though they really only want to be there for Mirah, that's the impetus. They have no interest in living in Mitzrayim. Their interest is to take care of the Rav. Ultimately, they couldn't leave. Why not? So let's look at a parallel parsha, which we looked at before. We looked at this parsha when Hashem told Yaakov, he told him, don't be afraid to go into Mitzrayim. We looked at Yirmiyah Perek Chavtes, where there's a similar message to people that are in Bavel, in Golus. The message is Revu Sham v'altim otu. Have children, just like Hashem told Yaakov. Don't be afraid to go down to Mitzrayim. Ki l'goy godol asimcha sham. So too Yirmiyah sent a message to the Goyim in Bavel. You will become a great nation there. Revu Sham. Will increase. And I have a plan to take you out of the future. Okay. So that parallels l'goy godol asimcha sham. And furthermore, as we mentioned, when Hashem told Yaakov l'goy godol asimcha sham, that's where the blessing to Avram, ve'eschol l'goy godol, is going to be fulfilled. Now, ve'eschol l'goy godol was told to Avram, specifically tied to the land of Canaan. Lech lecha la'aretz shereka ve'eschol l'goy godol. And here, where did it actually was fulfilled? Dafka sham, l'goy godol asimcha sham. And as it says, v'hisham l'goy godol in Parashat Kisavai. So apparently Mitzrayim over here is becoming like Canaan. And that's why Hashem told him, I will go with you to Mitzrayim. In other words, Yaakov thought I have to bring Zavach and Liliki. It's like at the border of Eretz Yisrael by Beersheba. But in fact, the Shekhinah was going down with him to Eretz Mitzrayim, which means that Mitzrayim became like the land of Hashem. Okay. Now, keeping that in mind, let's look at another parak. Also something we looked at, but not as frequently. Yeshaya parak Yud Tes Masa Mitzrayim. Hashem is riding to Mitzrayim, and the wise men of Mitzrayim don't know what's flying, don't know what's going. They don't understand the Eitz of Hashem. This takes us back to the beginning of Miketz, where you need a Yosef who can interpret the message from Hashem. Okay, a lot of references to Yosef and Yeshaya Perek Yud Tes. Then it talks about there's going to be 5 cities in the land of Mitzrayim that speak the Sfas Canaan and swear to Hashem. That's Sfas Canaan. It's like Sfas Le'adati Eshma. Okay, Sfas Hayor. Fine. There's going to be Mizbeach in Mitzrayim. Hashem is going to be known to Mitzrayim. V'yodu Mitzrayim is Hashem, and they're going to serve him. Amazing. And that day, this is the last 2 psukim in Yeshaya Perek Yud Tes. It's going to be a bracha b'kerev ha'aretz. The blessing in the midst of the earth is going to be Mitzrayim, Ashur, and Yisrael. Asher beruch Hashem tzavokes lemar. Baruch ami Mitzrayim, ma'aseh yodei Asher v'nachlas Yisrael. Okay. Parenthetically, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim. We thought about this when Pari says to Yosef, Atatia al Ami, and corresponding to that is the Mizmor says, Lu Ami Shemei Ali, so really we're the Am of Hashem. But actually, Mitzrayim is going to be and has the potential to be the nation of Hashem. Okay, so there's a bracha, Asher Berchei Hashem Tzavokis, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim, and the bracha is B'kerev Ha'aretz. Now, keep in mind, and Yaakov comes to Pari and gives him a bracha twice, Vayivorech, Vayivorech. He brings him the Birchas Hashem. Now, there's another bracha b'kerev ha'aretz, which is that Yaakov blesses Yosef about his children, v'yidgu l'roiv b'kerev ha'aretz. And, okay, which means what? They should increase and multiply in the land. Now, Shvatim, Ephraim, and Menashe, until they got to Eretz Yisrael, did not increase. That's what it says in Sefer Yeshua. When they got to Eretz Yisrael, they became so many, and there was not enough space there in their nachla. So while the rest of Bnei Yisrael increased in number in Mitzrayim, became a good gadol, Ephraim and Menashe only became so numerous b'kerev haaretz in Eretz Yisrael. Why is it that Ephraim and Menashe only became so numerous in Eretz Yisrael while the Bnei Yisrael became so numerous in Mitzrayim? Because for Yosef, Mitzrayim was like a galus land because he embraced it as a galus land and in the paradigm of Pari, in the paradigm of galus. But for the rest of Bnei Yisrael, it was like Eretz Yisrael because they came down with Yaakov, who gave a bracha. So now the bracha b'kerev haaretz in the end of Yishai over here is what allows for Eskel Gadol and Va'avarechacha, right? Going back to Lech Lecha. Eskel Gadol Va'avarechacha because Yaakov is bringing the very bracha of Eskel Gadol to Mitzrayim by grafting Mitzrayim onto Eretz Yisrael and making it like Eretz Yisrael. Mashenk and Yosef, who identified with the Mitzrayim that was decidedly not like Eretz Yisrael, so his bracha b'kerev haaretz had to wait for the littler Aretz Canaan. So that's the correspondence of here, the bracha b'kerev haaretz in the end of Yeshaya, and v'yidu lo b'kerev haaretz, and the bracha that Yaakov brings. Why am I telling all of you? Why am I telling this all to you? Because the whole idea of increasing there, which you see, Yaakov was told you will increase in Mitzrayim. And Yirmiyah tells them, Revusham Maltimatu. Why? Because I have plans. I have plans for you in Bavel. Dirshu Shloim Ha'ir. You're supposed to be there because something good is going to happen to you there. So similarly, the message to Yaakov is, I want you to be in Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is now not the place where Hashem doesn't want you to be, the place where Hashem does want you to be. And to be clear, that does not, in my opinion, mean that there's some, of course, change in Hashem's will. What that means is that Mitzrayim is now the place where tzaddikim, such as Yaakov, can have Das Hashem. So that becomes their Eretz Yisrael, like the Gemara says about Babel. Hadar b'Babel, Kedar b'Eretz Yisrael. For Yosef, it wasn't that place. So Yosef is not ready for Best Go until he comes back to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so now going back to the question, why didn't they leave? The answer is not some technical thing Hashem said, I'm going to take you out. It's not a technical thing. Hashem will take you out means, there's an oimik here as well, according to what I just said. Hashem will take you out means the time will come where your Das Hashem will come to its own in Eretz Yisrael, and then of course you belong in Eretz Yisrael. And that is Hashem taking you out, probably. That's what it means, I think. Okay? That is what it means. The parallel to Yirmiyah is just telling us how to understand why they didn't leave. Because the answer is because the message is that there is a plan of Hashem and a kind of revelation that's going to happen through what's happening in the land of exile, and that has to play itself out. Okay? What's not so clear to me, as I mentioned before, which point in the story are they saying it's like Eretz Yisrael? Why? Because when they're saying Lagur ba'aretz, so what was the question? They announced that it were just here for temporarily, but then they ended up staying. So what happened? So I said, because as Mitzrayim became like Eretz Yisrael, because Yaakov made it the land of the bracha. When they're saying Lagur, were they not yet thinking that? Because on the other hand, we just discussed that they talked about the mirror, which is associated with Eretz Yisrael. So this is not so clear. And also another kasha, why in general do Chazal say, Lagur means they're not Dil L'Shtakesh? As we mentioned earlier, we have the expression Lagur in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is called the land of the Megurim. So maybe they're here Lagur in this land, just like Avram had Eretz Megurim in Canaan itself. Although he's planning to be there for the long term, it's going to turn into an achuzah. So just because it said lagur ba'aretz, how does that tell us they're not planning on staying? Maybe it's a lagur that's going to turn into an achuzah, like exactly like Eretz Yisrael, which is lagurim and turns to achuzah. Similarly, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim, that they heard to turn Mitzrayim into Eretz Yisrael, and they're going to stay there. So I'm not sure how Chazal say that. Okay, now going back to Shaya Perak Lamed, the next pasuk thereafter it says, Hashem will give you lechem tzar mayim lachatz. So this is Perek Lamed Pasuk Chaf Aleph. There it says, "V'aznecha tishmana dov me'achavecha leimor zeh haderech l'chuvoi kisa aminu v'chisa asmilu." Then you'll hear a voice behind you. This is the path to go in. The way I'm taking that to mean, first of all, once you go with this paradigm of lechem tzar mayim lachatz, then you'll know where to go. Hashem will tell you where to go. So that supports this idea of they weren't ready to leave till Hashem takes them out. They're waiting because now they're in communication with Hashem in a certain way. And in a deeper way, what this means is that what the Navi is saying is that it's possible to live with Hashem such that you can see under what circumstances you can go further with Hashem. Right? In other words, I was saying before, what does it mean that Eretz Mitzrayim is the place of is where Hashem is sending them until He takes them out? It means that that's the place where they are going to experience full das Hashem to the extent possible, and the time will come when that changes. So that's the voice that says go back, the clarity. But in order to have that clarity, you have to be living with Hashem in a very fundamental way. Then you have that clarity that says, here's the path to take. Okay, this is an amazing thing if you can be zeicha to it, and that's corresponds to the beginning. Not zeicha, I mean, earn it. Yeah, that corresponds to the beginning of Perek Lamed where it says "Opiloi sha'olu." So you didn't ask the voice of Hashem when you went down to Mitzrayim, and the Navi is saying you can get to the point where you're going to hear a sound saying, "Here's where you should go." That's what we want. You don't want to do things without asking Hashem. So originally they went down to Mitzrayim, or Yosef went down to Mitzrayim without asking Hashem, and he's trying to pull them all down and saying, "Kifi hamedaber lechem koyomar bincha Yosef." But ultimately they go down with the Dvar Hashem, and therefore they don't leave because they're not ready they can't yet re-embrace the Dvar Hashem such as it is manifest out of Eretz Mitzrayim. That's what's going on over here. To respect the plan. Okay, and one other place is where we see actually this very specific plan playing out, because in Yirmiyah it says, Urevusham, you should increase in Mitzrayim, in Bavel. And similarly we find, of course, they're increasing in Mitzrayim, as you mentioned. And when they become so numerous, that's when they leave. That's the beginning of Parshat Shmos. There are too many, we have a problem. And we have that in Hosea Perek Beis also. And then v'nikbetzu v'samol l'Moshe v'olu min haaretz. Like v'olu min haaretz in Shmos. Hosea says. Which means that the method whereby Hashem takes us out of Golus is by us increasing, becoming so numerous. And then we say we got to leave. So that's the plan. And since that's the plan was respected in the case of Mitzrayim. Right? So that's why they didn't leave. Okay. Now let's go to the psukim. We'll talk a little bit about these psukim. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We have to read the psukim inside. We'll do that next time. I want to talk a little bit about the meeting of Yaakov and Paroi, because it relates to this whole discussion. We alluded to some of the points, and then we'll have to read the psukim inside next time. So, what's Yaakov doing saying Ma'at v'roim? In fact, the Ramban, what's his business complaining to a king? And also the Ramban asks, how could he say V'lo yisigu, maybe he's going to live? So that I answered before. I said, no, Yaakov thinks his life is over. But even though here Yosef already brought Yaakov, I think there's something happening over here where Yaakov is in the transitioning from his life being over to coming back to life. And the coming back to life happens Vayevorech Yaakov es Paroi, Vayetzu b'fnei Paroi, Vayoshev Yosef es Aviv. Those psukim, where Yaakov brings an end to the Rav, and that shows that Yaakov is back. So although it's hard to say that there's a sharp break there, and this is a problem, and as you see, I mentioned already, it comes up in other ways, but I think the V'lo Hisigu is going along with Yaakov ready to die. Okay. Now the Ramban's teretz is the following: that when the Paroi asked him, "Kama Yamesh Nechayecha," because he was like, "Wow, you look old," and to that Yaakov said, "Actually, I'm 130, but that's really not so old for me because my father's more than that. It's just that matram." It's like explaining. Okay, Adayin tzarich beer. But I will say, let's remember, the Vayamidehu lifnei Paroi, as opposed to Yosef, who was Omer lifnei Paroi, is supposed to draw attention to Yaakov's frailty. So therefore, Kami Meshnei Chayecha, it follows that Paroi should ask him, how old are you, that you're being propped up. So in other words, Ramban is not, you don't have to insert something into the pasuk that's not there. It actually is there because by saying Vayamidehu, Yaakov is being treated like he was wheeled in on a wheelchair and held up. So Paroi says to him, wow, how old are you? Okay. Now, let's ask a question. Why is he being propped up by Yamidehu? Because he's very old. Okay, but remember what it says in Yeshaya? Seif Perek Lametes, Seif Perek Mem. Koiv Hashem mechalifu koyach. Yalu Ever Kanashorim. And this is talking about Yaakov. Lomos Soiber Yaakov is Dabi Yisrael Nister Dakim Hashem Elakam Mishpata Yavad. Don't you know that Hashem is everywhere and gives Levi of Koyach? Now, that's your answer there. You know why Yaakov wasn't Zoichet to Koiv Hashem mechalifu koyach? Because he said Nister Dakim Hashem. And the Navi is saying it doesn't have to be this way. This is very key. This is key. That there's a tain on Yaakov that he said Nister Dakim Hashem, and by the way, there's another tain on Yaakov that he said Ma'at V'roim. So there's a theme over here about Yaakov that he doesn't recognize what Hashem is doing with him, and because of that, he doesn't access his Koiv Hashem Echalifu Koyach. So he doesn't fully tap in to the potential of what Yaakov could be. Okay, I'm just going to throw out a bunch of points. It's not going to come together fully, but because, like I said, there's a little bit of a problem here. What happens when? But the theme is definitely there. Paroi asked him about Shnei Chayov, and we have later Vayichi Yaakov. Shnei Chayim means years of life. Many people point out over here. It means years of successful years. It doesn't just mean being alive. I mean, obviously Shnei Chayim means your life, but it means successful years where you're alive, as we would say, like really alive, doing well. Years of well, especially because Chayim means health. So he's asking him, he's asking him, how many good years do you have? And he says, no, I didn't have good years, ma'at v'roim. But, so he's saying why I couldn't stand, right? He's explaining why can't he stand? Because I don't have good years. And that's an attitude thing, because really, if you wouldn't say Nister Dakim Hashem, and if you wouldn't say you had bad years, you would actually tap in to Koiv Hashem Echalifu Koyach, and you don't have to be young to stand. It's a myth, this thing, that you have to be young to stand. Yosef has stood because he's young, but actually Yaakov could have also stood. Only if he would not have said Nister Dakim Hashem, and he would have earned Koiv Hashem Echalifu Koyach. But he didn't. Because he's complaining. So I'm putting together the complaining with the Nister Dakim Hashem. Both of them Chazal censor him for, but I don't find that Chazal put those two together, but they seem to be very similar thing. Nister Dakim Hashem, you don't realize what I'm doing for you. Like Yaakov complained and he said, I forgot which pasuk Chazal say that on. Oh, Lama Hari Oisem Li. Yaakov said, Lama Hari Oisem Li. And Hashem says, what do you mean? I'm making your son into a king. And you say, Lama Hari Oisem Li. And they say a similar thing. Ma'at V'roim, you say Ma'at V'roim when Hashem is arranging everything. So it seems to be the same point. And because he's complaining, therefore he doesn't earn the Koiv Hashem Echalifu Koyach. But if we have Vayechi Yaakov, so actually he does eventually come back to life. So this is where I'm suggesting that there's a transition here. Yaakov is ready to die. But something changes. And it really changes when he blesses Paroi and therefore shows his spiritual powers. And now Vayechi, he's really back alive. So there's a certain mapech over here. Okay? And of course, the mapech revolves around the fact that rather so when Yaakov brings an end to the Rav, he shows that he's the one who doesn't need the Gvuras Hasus. Rather, as the Navi says, so why is he Vayamidehu? Oh, because at that point he still wasn't fully back to himself. So I want to read that that's what's happening over here in this conversation. We'll have to, I think, drill down to the details. And now I want to point out something in Mishlei Perek Yud, which again shows us this tension that on the one hand, Yaakov should have maybe done better than he did. On the other hand, he didn't. Mishlei Perek Yud, I will start from the beginning here to show you what I recall offhand from the references to the Yosef story, and then we'll get to the specific psukim that I'm focusing on that reflect this event. The specific psukim are pasuk of Zayin and on, where it talks about Yiras Hashem Toisif Yomim, which obviously you can see relates to our discussion here, because Yaakov is the Yirei of and there it talks about Toicheles Tzadikim Simcha. Okay, we'll get to that when we get to that. But I want to just briefly go through some of the allusions to Yosef in Perek Yud Mishlei, so you'll see that this whole Perek is talking about Yosef. Bein Chacham Yisamach Av Uben Ksel Tigras Imo. Yosef is the Bein who has to become Chacham and make his father happy and not his mother who died sad. And then it talks about the Oitzris Resha. Yosef is going to make the Oitzris and do tzedakah. And the next pasuk is about Hashem won't starve the Nefesh Tzaddik. Okay, this is the big theme about Hashem Yisireov. Those are the ones who Alachayos and Barav. And then it talks about wealth. And the next pasuk it talks about the son who collects in the summer, doesn't sleep, and the Ben Mever sleeps during the Katzah. This Yosef is planning ahead. Okay, brachos l'rosh tzaddik. We have Tiana l'rosh Yosef. Zeichat tzaddik l'vracha v'shem Hashem Yirkov. Okay, very good, fine. Then in Pasuk Yud there's something about atzeves. We're going to talk about later the brichs Hashem that doesn't have etzev. Keep that in mind. The Pete tzaddik that keeps people alive. Sinna and Ava. Pasuk Yud Beis is the big theme in Yosef and the brothers. Sifsei Navo in Timotzei Chachma. Yosef is the one who speaks, and Pari is so impressed with his chachma. Okay, fine. And then there's the wealth of the Ashir, the Tavua of the Rasha. Yosef is going to collect the Tavua. Moitzi Diba, and then we have Sinna again, and Moitzi Diba hu chsil. So Yosef is a chsil because of Yosef Diba Samra. Remember the first pasuk in this parak, it's about the Bein Chacham as opposed to the Bein Chsil, and Yosef has to prove and become the Bein Chacham. He started off as a Bein Chsil because he's Moitzi Diba. And B'Raiv Dram Lo Yachtal Pesha. Yosef talks a lot to the Ashes Potiphar. Goes on and on about why he can't accept her proposition instead of B'Choisich Tzfos, should have been quiet. Kesef Nivchol L'Shem Tzaddik, he deals with Kesef. He's going to collect all the Kesef. And Sifsei Tzaddik Yiru Rabim, he's going to be right all the whole land. Or maybe Yaakov will. Next pasuk. Birkas Hashem hi ta'asher v'lo Yosef. Yosef, sorry, but it's written Chaser, Yud Vav Samach Pei, Etzev Ima. So there's something called Etzev, B'itzovan Toichalena, and if you want to not have Yosef additional Etzev, then you have to have the Birchas Hashem, and this is, of course, by Yivarach Yaakov's Pare. Okay, now look at Pasuk Chavdalin. Megoiras Rosha Hisivoi Enu. I think this is a play on Tevua and Megurim, and on Eretz Megurehem. And that Chazal already do that. They say, oh, you know, the Pasuk says that Esav and Yaakov couldn't live in Eretz Megurehem. Oh, that's called Megoras Russia. Esav was afraid of the blessing coming true. Okay? Then, let's go to Pasuk Chavav. All right? Yiras Hashem Toisif Yomim Mushnois V'Sham Tiktzayna. Okay? So Yaakov is the Yirei Hashem, right? Because he gets separated from the Rav through year. And now he should live for a long time. Toisif Yomim. And yet he talks about how short his life is. And next Pasuk. Toichelas Tzadikim Simcha. Toichelas Tzadikim. This is so those that hope for Hashem are supposed to have simcha, and yet here, Yaakov, who's the Yirei of Mechal Mechaste, talks about his short life and how he's so depressed and everything is so awful. So he doesn't have simcha. Moiz latoim derech Hashem. He's the tam. Yaakov is tam. He's supposed to take strength in the derech Hashem, not in pare. Tzadik la'olam balimot. He's supposed to live forever. But then Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'loshen tapuches tikares. Now, we spoke about it someplace else in the Mishnah. Yosef is called the Ish tapuches because he turns Toiv into Ran to Toiv. That's the end of the Parak Yud, by the way. So I think what it means is like this. So in theory, Yiras Hashem Toisef Yomim and Techel Tzadikim Simcha. Yaakov is supposed to be very happy and supposed to live long. He didn't. Because ultimately, the Yosef story got to him, threw him off his game. The Loshen Tapuches. He wasn't able to orient himself properly to the Toiv because of the Mapecha between Ra and Toiv that Yosef introduced. So that's why, again, back to my point, the saying before, that ultimately, Yiras Hashem Toisef Yomim. So Yaakov is going to live another 17 years, like he lived his first good years, of Simcha, because Techel Sadikim Simcha. At this point, he's saying, it's over, because at this point, he's still not completely exercising the Birchas Hashem. You know when he does, Vayivorach Yaakov es Pari, obviously that's when he does the Birchas Hashem, then V'lo Yosef Atzavima, then he comes into his own as Yirei Hashem. So basically, if we assume a hard and fast break, which is obviously problematic, but let's say everything goes in one direction until Vayivorach Yaakov es Pari the second time, then it's beautiful. Except for the Mirish that we were talking about before, and except that Yosef was bringing him in to do something. But Yaakov was acting like someone who's not a Yirei Hashem and not Techel Sadikim, because he thinks his life is over. He thinks he can't bring an end to the Rav. But then something changes. So we have to understand better what changed. But that tracks onto this parak, and that tells me that things that are happening to Yaakov here, where he's not living long and he's not happy, are Yaakov not being the one who has the Birchas Hashem, which doesn't have the Etziv. It's only when he gives that bracha that he turns into the one who's bringing the midah of Yira to Mitzrayim, and then going back to what I said before. And then, now we're in Mitzrayim under Hashem's rule, not Yosef's rule, and therefore we're not going to leave until we understand Hashem wanting us to leave.